In the Alcatraz dining hall, late in the lunch line, a man stands up and the room goes quiet. A white inmate collapses in the space between benches. Blood hits the floor before anyone speaks. After that, the slurs stop. Guards rush in like they already know where the danger is. The biggest man in the room is suddenly the one backing away. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, does not shout. He does not hurry. He leaves a warning hanging in the air. What did he decide to wait for before he moved? In the Alcatraz dining hall, the noise did not rise. It dropped. Men stopped chewing. Trays held in midair. A guard's eyes moved first. Then the whole room followed. A white inmate was on the floor. His hands were at his face. One eye was gone. Not a rumor. Not a metaphor. Gone. There was blood on the concrete. There were boots running. There were whistles. There was the hard scrape of benches as bodies shifted away from the center of the room. And there was one man standing where he had been sitting. Calm. Not wide-eyed. Not frantic. Not trying to look innocent. He did not argue with the weapons pointed at him. He did not resist the cuffs. He let them take him. He had already decided where this was going. Later, the prison hospital recorded the damage. A long cut across the face. A second cut that ended the eye. Stitches followed. Then bandages. Then silence. Eric Polson had a reputation in that place. A large man. A violent man. A man who had learned how to hurt people without giving the guards a clean reason to put him away forever. In the weeks after, he did not speak much. He did not threaten anyone. He did not take food from other trays. He did not drift into other men's space in the showers. He did not test the air with that word, the one he had been using. It was not just that Polson was injured. It was that the pattern ended. Across the yard. Across the cell blocks. Across the cafeteria lines. The harassment stopped like a switch had been pulled. And men who had been loud became careful. Even the guards adjusted. They kept their eyes on different corners. They watched different faces. Because everyone understood the same thing. This was not an accident. It was not a random fight. It had timing. It had a target. It had a message. The official report would call it an assault. The rule book would call it contraband. The men who lived behind those walls called it something else. A correction. An enforcement. A line being drawn where the administration had refused to draw one. Polson had sat down where he was not invited. In full view. At a table that was not his. He had tried to turn a meal into a public lesson. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the room to watch a black man be reduced in front of everybody. He used the word. He used it more than once. And he reached his voice across the room toward a younger inmate who had already been bruised the day before. He did it like he owned the air. Then the room learned what ownership actually looked like. It happened fast. Too fast for a man Polson's size to turn it into a brawl. Too fast for most men to even stand. Fast enough that a dozen people would later disagree on the exact motion, but not on the outcome. They would all agree on the eye. They would all agree on the speed. They would all agree on the quiet face of the man who did it. And they would all agree on the one sentence he left behind. He said it after the blood hit the floor. He said it while guards were closing in. He said it with the same calm he used when he ate. Touch that young brother again. Silence. Call him that word again. Silence. And next time you won't visit a doctor. Silence. You'll visit God. That line traveled. It moved faster than transfer papers. It moved faster than disciplinary write-ups. It reached other prisons before the stitches were even removed. And it did what punishments and warnings had failed to do. It changed behavior. Polson survived. But he did not recover his old place. He left the dining hall alive. He left the island later. And he carried the mark for the rest of his life. Not just the scar. The knowledge. That size does not make you safe. That routine does not make you safe. That rules do not protect you if the people enforcing them decide to look away. Because what happened in that cafeteria did not look like rage. There was no shouting. No loss of control. No frenzy. This was not anger. It was a decision. Made in advance. Executed in public. And understood by everyone who saw it. Including the men with keys. To understand how this happened, we have to go back. Alcatraz was built to make men predictable. Lines. Counts. Silence. Rules that did not bend. It sat in San Francisco Bay. Cold water. Hard wind. A place designed to remove options. In October 1959, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was there. 54. He was in his 7th year on the island. A 15-year sentence. Federal narcotics conspiracy. He had arrived years earlier and survived the first test that matters inside any maximum security prison. He had learned who watched. He had learned who spoke too much. He had learned which fights were noise and which fights changed the air. By then, other inmates treated him carefully. Not because he was loud. Because he was consistent. He carried himself like a man who had already seen what panic costs. He did not beg for favor. He did not posture. He did not rush. Among black inmates, his name meant something specific. It meant protection that did not need a speech. It meant leverage. It meant a man who understood that respect is not a feeling. It is behavior. At Alcatraz, respect was currency. So was fear. And there were men who spent both. One of them was Eric Polson. He was not the kind of inmate who arrived by mistake. He was the kind the Bureau sent when other prisons could not hold the violence. A record that followed him. A body that made space without asking. A mind that understood how to hurt people without making it easy for guards to punish him for it. He had done time elsewhere. He had left damage behind him. He was known for targeting black inmates. Not quietly. Not accidentally. Deliberately. He enjoyed the way the word landed. He used it as a tool. He learned how to deliver it when a guard's back was turned. How to keep the act just below the line that would get him buried in solitary for months. In Alcatraz, there was always a line. Sometimes it was real. Sometimes it was theater. Polson lived inside that gap. He did not need to throw a punch every day. He could take food off a tray. He could bump a man in the shower and call it an accident. He could block a path in the yard and turn it into a lesson. And when someone flinched, he stored it. He used it later. The guards saw enough to know what he was. They also saw enough to know he was careful. Some of them tolerated him. He gave them fewer problems than open fighting. He kept certain men in place. That was the unspoken arrangement. Then Bumpy Johnson became a problem for Polson. Not because Johnson attacked anyone. Because he did not shrink. Because other inmates, black and white, treated him like a man worth addressing. Polson could not accept that. A black inmate receiving quiet respect in the center of the rock. An older man. Not large. Not loud. Still commanding space. For Polson, that was a challenge that had to be answered publicly. He did not want to fight Johnson. Not at first. He wanted to humiliate him. He wanted the room to watch. He wanted Johnson reduced. He wanted the respect to drain away. The first move was small. It happened in the cafeteria. Friday, October 16th, lunch. Polson walked past Johnson's table. He reached down. He took Johnson's dessert. A piece of apple pie. He did not stop. He did not ask. He carried it away like it already belonged to him. He sat down and ate it while looking back at Johnson, waiting for the reaction. The men at Johnson's table stiffened. They were ready. That is how fights begin in prison. A movement. A sound. A chair shifting back. Johnson did none of it. He looked at the empty space where the pie had been. He looked at Polson. Then he went back to his meal. No words. No threat. No performance. Polson took that as permission. A bully never mistakes patience for strategy. He mistakes it for weakness. He escalated. Monday, October 19th. The shower area. Steam and concrete. Wet floors. No privacy. Polson entered and ignored the open spaces. He walked straight toward Johnson. He shoved him. Hard enough to make a man slip. Hard enough to make a point. He claimed the shower like it was territory. He used the slur. Loud. So the room would hear it. Johnson stood. Water running down his arms. He looked at Polson for a long moment. Then he moved to another stall. No protest. No retaliation. The watching men read it the wrong way. They thought they were seeing retreat. They were seeing a calculation. Polson escalated again. Wednesday, October 21st. The yard. 1 hour outside. Air that still felt like prison. Men walking the perimeter because it gave the illusion of distance. Polson stepped into Johnson's path. Close. Blocking. He spoke like the yard belonged to him. He used the slur again. He demanded Johnson step aside. Johnson did. He went around. Polson laughed so others would register the outcome. It was public. That was the point. By the end of that day, the island was talking. Not in speeches. In looks. In whispers at the edges of count. Some inmates decided Johnson was letting himself be handled. Older inmates saw something different. They had seen this pattern before. A man gathering proof. A man letting the other side become confident. Confident men make mistakes. And on Thursday, Polson made the mistake that mattered. He chose a target who could not answer him. A young black inmate. A quiet man with no reputation for violence. Polson snatched his book. He mocked him. He used the slur like a hammer. When the young man reached for the book, Polson hit him with it. Then he threw it into dirty water near a drain. Guards intervened late. They gave Polson a warning. 1 day of recreation lost. Nothing that changed the balance. The young inmate went to the infirmary. A split lip. A dark bruise forming under the eye. That night, in the cell block, Johnson spoke to other black inmates. He did not make a speech. He made a statement. Tomorrow at lunch, Polson will learn a lesson. He said he had been patient. He said he had let Polson believe size was protection. He said the next move would be understood, not as a tantrum, as a response. And then the next day came. Friday. Lunch. October 23rd. The cafeteria ran on routine. Men filed in. Trays slid along the line. Metal clinked. Benches waited in rows. Guards stood at the edges with clear sight lines. The room was built to discourage surprises. Assigned tables. Limited time. Minimal talk. Violence in that space was supposed to be irrational. It was supposed to be punished quickly. That belief kept men seated. Bumpy Johnson entered with the rest. Standard prison clothes. Tray in his hands. He walked to his table and sat down. 3 other inmates with him. He began eating. No scanning. No signals. No performance. 2 minutes later, Eric Polson came in. He took his tray. He did not go to his assigned seat. He moved across the room. Direct. Intentional. He walked straight to Johnson's table and sat down in an empty place across from him. He set the tray down hard. He wanted the sound. He wanted heads to turn. Then he spoke, loud enough for nearby tables. He called Johnson out by reputation. He used the slur. He framed it like a joke. A public one. Johnson kept eating. He did not look up. He did not answer. That non-response didn't calm Polson. It sharpened him. Polson leaned forward. He pushed the word again. He demanded acknowledgement. He wanted Johnson to react like the men Polson was used to controlling. Johnson still did not move. Then Polson widened the stage. He turned away from Johnson and aimed his voice at the younger inmate he had humiliated the day before. Robert Jackson. 3 tables away. Bruises still visible. Polson shouted at him. He threatened him. He made it clear the harassment was continuing. Jackson looked down. He tried to disappear into his tray. Some men at Jackson's table began to rise. Guards barked orders. Stay seated. Sit down. Hands where they can be seen. The room hesitated. That hesitation was Polson's oxygen. Then Johnson stood up. Not slow. Not rushed. Just up. A simple movement that changed the room's geometry. His right hand went to his waist. To the place where a shirt tucked into pants can hide something thin. His fingers closed. He pulled it free. A small blade. Improvised. Sharpened. A prison weapon made for close work. He stepped around the table. 8 feet. No running. Just forward. Polson saw it and started to rise. His hands came up. Too late. Johnson's arm moved once. A horizontal cut. Face level. A long line opened across Polson's cheek and jaw. Blood followed immediately. Polson's hands went to his face. Instinct. Shock. Pain. The room was still processing the first motion when Johnson's arm moved again. Upward. Diagonal. A second slash that crossed the first. It caught the eye. It ended the eye. Polson fell backward. Over the bench. Onto the floor. His screaming filled the space that had been quiet a moment earlier. Trays tipped. Men ducked. The cafeteria broke apart into instinct and fear. Whistles blew. Boots hit concrete. Guards rushed in with weapons drawn. Commands layered over each other. Down. Get down. Hands out. Don't move. Johnson did not chase. He did not continue. He dropped the blade. He raised his hands. He let them take him. He let them drive him to the floor. He let the cuffs close. He did not struggle to look brave. He did not plead to look harmless. Before they pulled him away, he spoke. One sentence. Measured. For Polson. For the room. For the younger inmate Polson had been hunting. Touch that young brother again. Silence. Call him that word again. Silence. And next time you won't visit a doctor. Silence. You'll visit God. Then the guards moved him out. Polson stayed on the floor. Hands clamped over his face. Blood slipping through his fingers. A guard knelt beside him. Another shouted for medical. In the prison hospital, they stitched the first cut. They tried to save what they could. They could not save the eye. The island did what it always did after violence. It investigated. It documented. It separated the players. Johnson went into solitary, a cell designed to take away conversation and light. Polson went into the hospital, a body designed to heal what could be healed. For 2 weeks, officials interviewed men who had been seated at nearby tables. Men in the line, men in the yard, men in the showers. They asked about the week. They asked about the slurs. They asked about the book. They asked about the thread across the cafeteria. And the story came back the same. Polson had been building it. Day by day, publicly, test by test. Johnson had been refusing to react until the moment could be framed as something else. Defense. Protection. A response to an escalating threat in front of witnesses. Johnson's statement to investigators was simple. He said Polson had been harassing black inmates. He said Polson had targeted him. He said Polson had attacked the younger inmate. He said guards had not stopped it. He said he defended himself and another prisoner. He said he used the minimum force necessary to end it. He did not say he was sorry for the outcome. He said he regretted that violence was necessary. But he said it was necessary. The administration faced a choice. If they crushed Johnson with extra years, they would be admitting something they did not want to put on paper. That Polson's behavior had been known, that it had been tolerated, that the prison had failed to contain a racist bully until another inmate did it for them. So they did what institutions do when they need to preserve the appearance of control. They punished the weapon. They punished the assault. They kept the sentence intact. 30 days in the hole. A disciplinary action that satisfied the rule book without opening the larger question. Then, quietly, they removed Polson from the island. A transfer. A solution that did not require a confession. And inside Alcatraz, the change was immediate. White inmates who liked Polson's style became quiet. Men who had enjoyed the word stopped using it near Johnson. Younger black inmates watched him differently. Not with celebration. With recognition. Because on the rock, protection is not promised. It is proven. And now it had been proven in the most permanent way possible. What mattered most was not the blood. Alcatraz had seen blood before. What mattered was the precision. The timing. The fact that it ended a pattern the guards had let grow. After that day, Polson's type understood something they did not want to accept. The quiet man at the table might be the most dangerous man in the room. And the administration understood something too. Johnson had just enforced an order they had failed to enforce themselves. So the legend spread. Not as a story about rage. As a story about control. As a lesson. About patience. About optics. About choosing the moment when the whole room is watching. And making sure the whole room understands what it saw. In that prison, there were rules that never appeared on a board. They were not written in the handbook. They were enforced anyway. You could ignore them. Once. Sometimes twice. Then the building corrected you. Not with speeches. With outcomes. Bumpy Johnson understood that system. He did not try to dominate the rock the way most men tried. He did not walk around looking for enemies. He did not build a reputation by starting problems. He built it by controlling problems. Quietly. He treated the guards with visible discipline. Yes, sir. No, sir. Rules followed precisely. Not because he believed in the institution. Because he understood the mechanics. A guard who has no reason to focus on you is a guard who leaves you room to operate. A guard who sees you as predictable is a guard who stops searching for hidden motives. That predictability was a weapon. The inmates noticed. Not the politeness. The intention behind it. They watched the way he never raised his voice. The way he never begged. The way he never explained himself. In Alcatraz, explanation was weakness. Because it gave people something to pull on. Johnson gave them nothing. He also did something that looked simple from the outside. He listened. When men argued over territory in the yard. When a debt turned into a grievance. When a stare became a problem. When someone's pride needed an answer. They brought it to him. Not because he demanded it. Because both sides trusted the same thing. He would not embarrass them. He would not talk too much. He would not turn their private business into a public show. That was the first rule of his world. No unnecessary noise. Noise attracted attention. Attention created crackdowns. Crackdowns created searches. Searches created losses. In a place like Alcatraz, a small loss could cascade into a bigger one. So he kept things tight. If a dispute could be settled with a sentence, it was settled with a sentence. If a man had to be warned, he was warned once. Quietly. If a boundary had to be drawn, it was drawn in a way that did not require a crowd. Johnson understood crowds. Crowds create pressure. Pressure creates mistakes. And mistakes in prison do not disappear. They become paperwork. They become solitary. They become transfer. They become a longer sentence. So the rule was restraint. Not softness. Restraint. Another rule was fairness. Not fairness in the moral sense. Fairness as a survival method. If you are seen as biased, people stop coming to you. If they stop coming to you, they stop respecting your judgment. If they stop respecting your judgment, they start solving things in the old way. Steel. Boots. Blood. Johnson did not need that. He needed stability. So he acted like an arbiter. When he spoke in group conversation, men listened. Not because he talked the most. Because he talked the least. He did not waste words. When he walked the yard, other inmates adjusted their routes. Not because a rule required it. Because the culture did. An informal right-of-way. A nod. A pause. Small signals that meant the same thing. This man is not to be interrupted. This man is not to be tested casually. This man is not a hobby. By 1958, multiple former inmates described what he built as an invisible empire of influence. No title. No official position. No visible authority. Just outcomes. If someone needed protection, the threat often disappeared after a quiet word. If someone needed a message carried, it could be arranged. If a conflict was brewing, it could be cooled before it became a spectacle. That is how order is maintained in a maximum security prison. Not through declarations, through management. And management depends on another rule: silence. Johnson's genius was knowing when to talk and when to stay silent. Silence protected him from being pinned to events. Silence protected other people from being forced to name him. Silence allowed rumors to grow without becoming evidence. If you confirm, you become responsible. If you deny, you invite further questions. If you stay silent, you stay mobile. He let men believe what they wanted to believe. He let the legend work without giving the administration something solid to prosecute. The code of silence was not romantic. It was a tool. It kept operations intact. It kept alliances intact. It kept doors open. Even his personal routine reflected the same discipline. He read history, biography, strategy. Men who shared a cell block with him remembered it. They remembered that he studied power like a craftsman. They remembered him drawing lessons from figures who built control under hostile conditions. He reduced it to principles. One of them came back again and again. Same principle applies here. Silence. A pause. You earn loyalty by treating people well. In Johnson's world, what was permitted was simple: respect, consistency, controlled speech, private correction. What was not permitted was also simple: public humiliation, uncontrolled ego, random cruelty that created chaos, loose talk that brought heat. If you wanted to move around him, you learned those rules fast. If you wanted to be close to him, you learned them faster. Because his power did not require constant demonstration. It required constant discipline. And discipline is only real when it is enforced. Breaking those rules always came with a price. After the cafeteria, the island corrected itself. Not officially, not in speeches, in behavior. Men who had been casual with the slur stopped using it in open air. Men who had enjoyed Polson's showmanship learned the cost of an audience. And men who had been quiet out of fear became quiet out of strategy. Because one thing was now settled. If the administration would not draw the line, Johnson would. The guards tried to keep it procedural. They framed it as discipline, contraband, assault, 30 days in the hole, a controlled penalty that said the rules still mattered. But the real message was in what they did not do. They did not add years. They did not make an example that would force questions about why Polson had been allowed to operate. They did not want a spotlight on the gap between policy and reality. So they punished the blade. And they avoided the deeper failure. Then they moved Polson, quietly, a transfer framed as routine. No announcement, no admission, just removal. Inmates read it the way inmates always read administrative choices. Polson had been the problem. Johnson had been the solution. That is how it felt inside the blocks. And that feeling altered the ecosystem. Johnson came back from solitary with the same posture. No victory lap. No speeches. No celebrations. He returned to his table. He ate. He walked the yard. He let the air carry the lesson without him repeating it. That restraint mattered. Because reckless men talk after violence. They boast. They recruit attention. They create new enemies. Johnson did not. He let others do the talking. The story spread anyway. 2 cuts. 3 seconds. 1 eye gone. A threat that landed like a verdict. It traveled through transfers and visiting rooms and guard gossip. It became the kind of story that older inmates used to teach younger ones how prisons actually function. Not on paper. In practice. Be patient. Be observant. Let the other man expose himself. Then, if you must act in a way that ends the problem. Not in a way that starts a war. That was the real mythology that formed around Johnson on the Rock. Not that he was violent. Alcatraz had violence in every corridor. The myth was that he was controlled. That he chose the moment. That he understood optics. That he could make an act look like necessity. And in prison, necessity is the only shield that sometimes works. The younger black inmates treated him differently after that. Not with loud gratitude. With distance. With deference. They watched how he moved. How he spoke to guards. How he handled disputes. They understood something Polson had refused to learn. If you are protected in a place like that, you do not test the protector. You do not create problems that force him to burn leverage. You do not drag him into chaos for your pride. You stay disciplined. Because discipline is how protection stays available. Even white inmates adjusted. Not all of them, but enough. The ones who liked intimidation learned that intimidation has limits. The ones who used language as a weapon started choosing silence instead. Because they had seen what happens when the wrong man decides the conversation is over. That is what Johnson really bought with those 3 seconds. Not peace. Control. A change in what was permissible. A change in what was safe. For the rest of his time on the island, his name became a boundary, not a boast. A boundary. Men did not test him for sport. Guards did not treat him like a clown. And the administration, whether it admitted it or not, benefited from the outcome. The most disruptive racist bully had been neutralized without the prison having to confess it had allowed him to operate. The slurs dropped. The public harassment eased. The yard became quieter. That is what institutions like most. Quiet. And Johnson understood that, too. That is why the story did not end with Polson. It followed Johnson beyond Alcatraz. Because it was not just a prison incident. It was a demonstration of method. Patience used as bait. Restraint used as camouflage. Violence used as punctuation. Applied once. Applied decisively. Then never discussed again by the man who did it. When Johnson eventually left the island, he carried that reputation with him. And when men spoke of him later, they rarely started with Harlem money or street politics. They started with Alcatraz. With the cafeteria. With the eye. Because that moment reduced everything about him into one clean principle. You could underestimate his age. You could underestimate his size. You could underestimate his silence. But if you confused silence with weakness, you paid for the mistake. And the payment was permanent. When the story left the island, it changed shape. Not in the facts. In the purpose. Inside Alcatraz, it was a warning. Outside, it became currency. Men carried it to other federal yards. Atlanta, Leavenworth, Marion. Places where names meant more than identification. They meant leverage. Transferred inmates told it the same way. A racist bully. A week of pressure. A cafeteria full of witnesses. A calm man standing up. 2 cuts. 1 eye gone. 1 sentence that ended the conversation for everyone listening. The details sharpened with each retelling. Not because people wanted accuracy. Because they wanted a clean lesson. They wanted proof that a man could stop a pattern the system would not stop. That story spread through black inmates first. It moved like reassurance. A reminder that humiliation was not inevitable. A reminder that a bully could be corrected. Not by pleading. Not by complaining. By a decision made in the right moment. But the story also moved through white inmates. The ones who liked intimidation. The ones who had been comfortable using the word like it was free. They heard it differently. As a warning that the old habits had limits now. That a certain kind of disrespect could come with a cost that could not be repaired. Some of them dismissed it. Until they saw the scar on Polson's face in another yard. Until they heard the same story from another mouth. Until they realized there was no benefit in testing it. Because prison is not ruled by courage. It is ruled by risk. And risk is calculated. The story was also useful to guards. Not officially. Unofficially. It gave them a narrative that made sense of a problem they did not want to own. Polson had been difficult. Polson had been disruptive. Polson had been the kind of inmate who created long-term instability. Then Polson was removed. And the island got quieter. That is what the institution wanted. So the story was allowed to live. Not celebrated. Not corrected. Just allowed. Because it served the larger order. Polson's life after the island reflected the same correction. He carried the scar. He carried the missing eye. He carried a changed posture. The accounts describe him as quieter. Less threatening. More withdrawn. That is what happens when a man's certainty is taken from him in public. He had lived on the belief that size was authority. That violence on the outside proved superiority on the inside. Johnson dismantled that belief with speed. And the result was permanent. The younger inmate who had been the immediate target that day lived with a different kind of permanence. Robert Jackson served out his time and left. He did not become famous. He did not become powerful. He became something more common. A man who remembered what it felt like to be cornered. A man who remembered what it felt like when someone older stood up and ended the threat. The later accounts say he kept a clipping about Johnson's death. Not as a trophy. As proof. Proof that what happened had been real. Proof that someone had once intervened when the system did not. And Johnson himself carried the incident like he carried everything else. Quiet. Controlled. He did not use it as a story to entertain men. He did not build speeches around it. He let it sit in the air and do its work. That kind of restraint was part of why the story stayed alive. Because men fill silence with imagination. And imagination turns events into legend. In November 1963, Johnson left Alcatraz. 10 years served. The island behind him. The cold water behind him. The routines behind him. He went back to Harlem. Back to streets that moved differently than prison corridors. Back to a world where power was measured in money, alliances, and the ability to keep order without police doing it for you. He reclaimed what could be reclaimed. Old relationships. Old obligations. Old territory. But he returned carrying something Harlem understood immediately. a reputation that had been tested in the one place designed to strip reputations away. Alcatraz did not make men bigger. It made them smaller. It reduced them to numbers and rules and routines. If you left that place with your name intact, it meant something. If you left with your name elevated, it meant more. Johnson's Alcatraz story became part of his Harlem aura, not because Harlem admired prison violence for its own sake, because Harlem respected method, patience, timing, knowing when to wait, knowing when to strike, knowing how to end a problem in a way that discouraged copies. The cafeteria incident fit that logic perfectly. Years later, when Johnson died in July 1968, the story did not die with him. It hardened. Death does that. It seals a man's reputation into a finished form. No new mistakes. No decline. No public unraveling. Just a fixed set of images that people repeat until they feel true. For Johnson, one of those images was always Alcatraz. A lunch table. A bully performing. A room full of witnesses. A man standing up without a word. And an outcome that made the whole institution adjust. That is why the legend lasted. Not because it was the most brutal violence The Rock ever saw. Alcatraz had seen worse. It lasted because it was clean. It lasted because it had a beginning that looked like humiliation and an ending that looked like control. It lasted because it offered a principle men could carry into other cages. Do not rush. Do not perform. Do not fight on someone else's terms. Let the other man expose himself. Then end it. And when you end it, make sure the room understands why it ended. Then go back to eating. After Alcatraz, the story didn't live because of the blood. It lived because it reset the math. In prison, power is measured in what people do when they think nobody can stop them. Poulson had been operating inside a protected space. Not a cell. A behavioral space. The thin zone where harassment stays just below the threshold of punishment. That zone exists in every institution. Because enforcement is never perfect. Because some guards are indifferent. Because some guards agree. Because paperwork is work. Johnson did not attack the institution. He attacked that zone. He forced it to collapse. He took a week of small humiliations and turned them into a single public record. Food taken. A shove in the showers. A blocked path in the yard. A young man struck with a book. Then a threat in the cafeteria. The sequence mattered. It built provocation. It built witnesses. It built a story that could be repeated without anyone needing to embellish it. When the administration investigated, they had a problem. If they punished Johnson with extra years, they were also confirming that their own control had failed. Because the testimony would show Poulson's pattern. It would show tolerance. It would show that men had been left exposed until an inmate enforced the boundary for them. So they chose the institutional compromise. They punished the weapon. They punished the act. They did not expand the sentence. And then they removed Poulson. That is the part the outside world often misses. The transfer was an admission without a statement. A quiet correction. A bureaucratic way of saying the same thing the cafeteria had said out loud. The bully was the instability, not the man who ended him. From that point forward, Johnson's influence inside the prison did not need to be demonstrated again. Because demonstrations invite challenges. And challenges invite cycles. Johnson avoided cycles. He preferred finality. So he went back to routine. Back to controlled speech. Back to the posture that made guards treat him as predictable. That predictability was part of his armor. It kept him from becoming a daily target for searches and discipline. It kept him from becoming an administrative project. And it kept his name usable as a boundary rather than a provocation. Inside the blocks, men adjusted fast. Racist prisoners did not become enlightened. They became cautious. They learned that certain words were now expensive. That certain performances could end in permanent damage. Even those who hated the lesson understood it. Hatred is emotional. Prison is practical. Practicality wins. For black inmates, especially the younger ones, the lesson cut differently. It wasn't romance. It wasn't a fairy tale about justice. It was proof that a man with discipline could protect others in a system that often refused to. That mattered more than ideology. Because in prison, ideology does not stop a shove. It does not stop food being taken. It does not stop a man deciding you are a convenient target. Only leverage stops it. Only consequences stop it. Johnson created consequences. And the administration, for its own reasons, allowed those consequences to stand. That is why the story traveled. Because it worked. It produced a measurable change. Not for a day, for years. And when Johnson left Alcatraz in November 1963, that reputation followed him back to Harlem like a second shadow. In Harlem, people already knew he could build order. They already knew he could negotiate with men who thought they owned the streets. What Alcatraz added was proof under laboratory conditions. A place designed to strip men down to routines and rules. A place where reputations usually decay. If you could maintain control there, your name carried extra weight everywhere else. Johnson's death in July 1968 sealed it. Death freezes a story. No more contradictions. No more decline. No more chance for the legend to be challenged by later weakness. So the cafeteria became an anchor point. A clean, brutal proof of method. Patience. Witnesses. Timing. A single act that ended a pattern. And then silence. That last part is why it stayed powerful. He didn't keep talking about it. He didn't need to. The scar did the talking. The missing eye did the talking. The changed behavior did the talking. And in the world Johnson came from, that is the only kind of talking that matters. The legend is simple on the surface. A racist bully spoke. An older man stood. A blade flashed. And I was lost. But the deeper story is about how violence becomes policy when institutions refuse to enforce their own. Polson didn't just insult. He staged his cruelty. He selected moments where guards were present but unwilling. He used humiliation because humiliation is hard to punish. He used the slur because it is a weapon that leaves no bruise. He chose public spaces because public spaces create witnesses. And witnesses create fear. Johnson understood the architecture of that fear. He did not answer the first provocation because answering it would have made him the aggressor. He did not answer the shove because answering it would have been framed as a fight. He did not answer the yard confrontation because the yard has too many angles and too many narratives. He waited for the one place the administration could not pretend not to see. The cafeteria. Clear sight lines. Guard stationed. Assigned seating. Routine. If something happened there, it was documented. If something happened there, it was everybody's problem. So Polson walked into that room thinking he was still in control. He took the seat. He raised his voice. He used the word again. Then he made the mistake that turned Johnson's patience into permission. He threatened a younger inmate. In front of witnesses. In front of guards. At that moment, Polson wasn't just insulting. He was signaling an imminent attack. And Johnson's response could be framed as protection. Not pride. Not revenge. Protection. That framing mattered more than the blade. Because the blade only solves one man. The framing changes how the whole system reacts after. And the system did react. It punished Johnson enough to preserve the rule book. It did not punish him enough to expose the prison's failure. Then it removed Polson. Quietly. That was the institutional confession. A transfer instead of an apology. A solution instead of accountability. After that, the island's social order recalibrated. Not because men became better. Because the cost of open racism became unpredictable. Because the quiet man had proven he could end a pattern in seconds. Because the administration had proven it would quietly accept the result. So the story lasted. Not because it was the worst violence Alcatraz ever saw. Because it was the clearest example of method. Strategic patience. A public record of provocation. A decisive strike. A message delivered without theatrics. Then silence. That is why men repeated it for decades. It wasn't entertainment. It was instruction. And it left one final warning hanging over every retelling. In a place built to control men, the most dangerous power is the power that knows exactly when the rules will protect it.